Good morning. Welcome to our panel. We are going to have a really great discussion on commercial pricing today. I am joined by Laura Randa, can do a little of this, Alex Santini, and Jennifer Billet. We decided that we're going to be really efficient with your time and not go greatly into our bios because we're going to be able to show you how much we know about pricing through the discussion. So I'd like to get right to it because I'm looking forward to what I'm going to learn. Biotech companies must prove to regulatory agencies, to business partners, to investors, and to the public that they can produce and support their products consistently and safely once they receive marketing approval. Our conversation today is going to be about pricing, but that's not a unilateral decision that needs to be made. It needs to be made in the context of many other things. So while pricing is the main goal, we're going to talk about a lot of other things that are going to be important for you to know about as we go into pricing. One quick thing about questions, if you have them, please feel free to ask them in the chat feature. I will monitor it. And if I don't ask it immediately, I will ask it as soon as I possibly can because we don't want to interrupt a good flow of conversation. So I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves and then we'll just jump right into the questions. I think we waved a little bit, but a quick question, a quick title and company would be great. Alex, do you want to go first?
So good morning, everyone. Alex Santini. I'm currently the SVP for Market Access Trading Channel Management at Nectar Therapeutics. And I'm preparing the organization to launch their first commercial brand in 2022. So this is a very relevant topic today. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Petrullo Billet with Sage Therapeutics. Currently, I lead the NMDA franchise in health economics and outcomes research with assets targeting the neuropsychiatry space. So I'm responsible for driving the early pipeline research, including evidence generation strategy, linking outcomes assessments to payer needs, and overall setting the stage for successful launches down the road.
Excellent. That's a lot to put on a business card. And Laura.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be part of this esteemed panel. I've spent 10 years in federal and state government. In the first part of my career, commercial leader, really focused on bringing products to market. I've done 33 drug launches. I've been at GSK, Novartis, and Abbott, but been at a lot of small companies as well. Avenir, a recent private equity firm, as well as Regeneron. And look forward to the discussion. So critical.
So let's just go right into it. Planning the resources and budgets required for a successful launch needs to start several years out, especially for a company new to commercialization. What factors need to be considered in that planning? And I'll say, whoever would like to start, just jump right in. Trying to keep this a little bit informal.
So clearly, Laura, you alluded to the importance of making certain that there's a cross-functional readiness when you're thinking about bringing a brand to the marketplace. And you need to make certain that all the relevant disciplines are in place far enough in advance. And I would say far enough in advance is usually that 2 to 3 year window prior to launching your first brand. And from a functional responsibility standpoint, you clearly need to have that market access capability in place. You need to have trading channel management capability in place. You need to have health economics and outcomes research in place. And I would say that those 3 disciplines are critically important. And the sooner you can get those in place, the better it will be for the brand.
And, Alex, I think you're exactly right. And just to build on that concept is we don't win anymore just with regulatory approval. We absolutely need to bring value, operationalize flawless and differentiation of our product. So the beginning of commercialization, integration with even the clinical program, with the R&D, the supply chain, really should start early. Many investors are now really asking for that information early. What is the value that you're bringing to the market? What's the differentiation? What's your targeted patient profile? So I think those conversations have to happen earlier and earlier just to make sure you have the right target, set the right value, and what you're going to bring with the product in certain markets.
Yeah, Laura, and to your point, I think early meaning phase 1 and phase 2 give you the inclusion of the evidence that you need to start building messages coming out of phase 2. And as you're preparing for your phase 3 studies or running your phase 3 studies and kind of adding on to that database, you need to start thinking about what will drive use later on down the road and get that in as early as possible.
So how should a small company consider acquiring the right talent to do this planning? Rent, buy, borrow? What are the combinations that we could go to?
I think, go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead, Alex.
I would say that, the disciplines that are critically important that we've just referenced, market access, medical, HEOR. I mean, you certainly need to have that discipline in your organization. And there's different models where you could potentially put those leaders in place that will lead those functions. And then you could hire resources to support those leaders. That's the model that I actually prefer, where we bring in some of our own folks that actually take responsibility for the functional activities, but we could maybe outsource some of our day-to-day activities to third-party entities that do this work well. And then as you get closer to launch, you can start building out more and more of your own staff. As you know that you're going to be actually launching the brand and you haven't overcome any barriers that will prevent you from launching, you don't have all of those FTEs on board too soon, but you're ready when the launch date occurs.
Just to build on that, I think, Alex is actually a pro at actually managing resources at the right time within the right cycle of organizations. And I think that's really, really critical for emerging companies as we think through that, right? Hire the right leadership talent, that builds together the right expertise. And then also, the other part, and, when do you bring those rest of those employees in? Do you bring them in, early, or do you even do it post-launch, and kind of, do the rent model in the interim? So I think really strategically think through that. I think the other part of it is really thinking about the strategic partnerships and what role strategic partners will play in the commercialization, because the cash management flow is so critical for really the thriving and surviving of a small company.
Okay. Anything you would add, Jennifer?
I agree. It keeps you nimble. I think the important thing to keep in mind with this structure, though, is maintaining transfer of knowledge. So, the strategy that you've got in place early on, you're able to have a strong external partner that can, leverage their internal data or their internal resources to keep that knowledge, essential to, core to what you're building out for the program.
So when you say partner, are you thinking commercialization partner, or are you thinking vendor that you would access, or both? Just let's unpack that a little bit.
I actually think it's actually one more. I think it's both of those, Laurie, plus a development partner, right? Because I think there's lots of companies, I was at Regeneron. Regeneron, was built on partnerships. ILEA ex-US is with Bayer. The rest of, a lot of the portfolio is with Sanofi. And then part of the pain partnership is with Teva. So it's a lot about thinking through, what makes sense, development, commercial, and, really thinking through where do you have resources and where do you want to kind of fill those gaps, which I think is really, really critical. That you really think not only short term, though, when you build these partnerships, but also think long term. And I think that's the part that we must remember, is not just think for the here and now, but also think, how is this going to impact us when we launch +3, +5, +7, +10?
Interesting. A lot of companies that raise $170, $200 million think maybe they can go it alone. What's the question that the C-suite and the board members should ask in those types of scenarios to define that?
Well, I think you really have to determine, before you can make that decision to go at it alone, you really need to determine what is the outcome that you're desiring and the time frame that you have to achieve that outcome. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, what will it take to have a successful launch? As an example, if you're launching in the US and only the US, you may say, well, what will it require for us to launch in the US market successfully? Do we need to build out this entire infrastructure of medical personnel, med affairs personnel, marketing personnel, sales personnel, market access personnel, trading channel management personnel, or can we create elements of those functions, create resources that are experts in that arena, but again, outsource some of the secondary resources that may not be as important. So that's one approach. I've been involved in companies where we have said, it's not feasible for us to launch in Europe as a small biotech company. Yet we want to bring our brand to that marketplace, but it's not feasible for us economically to invest in Europe. So we'll partner that out, to Laura's point. Or we'll have a hybrid model and we'll hire a GM for Europe and then hire out all of the third-party support that will kind of report up through a dotted line to that individual. So there's a lot of flexibility. I think we need to be less committed to like they have to be our FTEs. They must be part of our organization, and more about let's make certain that we bring the right resources in and that they're really experts in their craft.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you have to start with the strategy, secure the alignment, and then build your resources and budget. And I think with those, really understanding what you're bringing to the marketplace, and I think that really should guide you. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So the big unanswered question though at this stage is what is the pricing of the product going to be? And Jennifer, give us a little bit of your insights into the new expectations on demonstration of value.
I think what we're seeing now is a real attachment of the clinical benefit, what the primary outcome is, to an expectation of what is happening with the patient specifically. What can I see within the patient, and linking those outcomes together. So, obviously the primary endpoint is very important, but functioning ends up being elevated more in these discussions, more recently. And so this is where, having a robust outcome strategy in your clinical trials, or having real world data that you can link to that shows you this is where the trajectory is of patients and this is where we're intervening, and having this bridge of information that kind of takes, your primary outcomes, some secondary outcomes, and then the real world data trajectory, and having this framework for payers to understand this is, what you can see from the clinical perspective, but this is what the patients are going to, observe as well, and having that as your driver of, your value communication.
And
Alex, what are you thinking? Have you seen this?
Yeah. Alex, she tossed it over to you.
So I would say that, critically important are the outcomes and the data to support the outcomes that we're going to be conveying and communicating to our key payer audiences. Laura had indicated that the landscape has changed dramatically. So regulatory approval alone is not going to guarantee any success for brands that are coming to the market today. And we probably have all been part of launches that have not gone as well as we may have anticipated. I think we have a wonderful opportunity with payers in this particular time. They are very open for us sharing information with them and sharing our clinical data and sharing our insights and sharing our market landscape assessments. They're very interested in understanding how does your drug or therapy improve upon the current standard of care? And is it incrementally better? Is it significantly better? And what are those outcomes that are tied to that particular therapy and that intervention? And then, of course, if you're able to convince a payer that the current therapy that you're bringing to the marketplace is significantly better than standard of care, then the next question is, and what will the price be? So, you really do need to differentiate the brand clinically from an efficacy standpoint, could be from a safety standpoint, could be from a dosing standpoint, but then there has to be an element that ties back to at what cost. And you really need to be well armed with data to support those discussions.
So I completely agree with both Jennifer and Alex. And I think just to continue the conversation, we must remember that 70% of all brands miss their forecast. With that in mind, we have to say, how do we make sure as a leader that we're going to bring this important innovation, this important technology to the market? So as Alex alluded to, we're fortunate enough now that, we have guidance that we're allowed to be out with payers early. I've been part of organizations that at least 18 months prior, right after the phase 2 data, it is critical to be out engaged with payers to assure that you're talking about who is the target patient profile. Here are the pricing ranges that you're talking about. Here's how we're going to commercialize. Here's how we're going to distribute it. And here's how we're going to handle the patient affordability. This is absolutely critical so that they have this information for their downstream clients, so that as they're in discussions with how that therapy is actually changing the management, here's what pipeline products are coming to the market, that they can plan for your important innovation. So I just think that is one of the most critical tools that we now have in our toolbox. Getting that feedback, bringing it inside, and then modifying the strategy any way that we need to do to make sure that we're set up for success.
Absolutely. Payers love nothing more than being able to forecast.
I'm going to switch a little bit to patient assistance programs. What lessons have you learned from being involved in patient assistance programs? And I throw it out there to see who wants to go first.
I would say that, in my most recent launches, there's different types of products. So you could have products that, sit on the oral side of the arena. They could be a Part D drug, and then you have drugs that are Part B drugs that have a different coinsurance obligation. I think you need to have a good understanding of the landscape and how drugs are going to be reimbursed, whether they're an oral medication or an IV medication. You really have to have a good understanding of that dynamic. And then you need to know what parameters you may have in place to support patient affordability. So as an example, we could support our commercial patients to a larger degree than we can support our Medicare patients. And that becomes a little bit of a challenge. Patient affordability on expensive medications becomes a challenge for those individuals that don't have, say, supplemental coverage to offset some of that, high coinsurance obligation that they may have. And if you don't have a good understanding of that dynamic, when you're forecasting what you believe is going to be your uptake curve, you will be significantly off base. So you really need to do a good job of understanding what your patient mix is, and then the reimbursement pathway associated with each of those patient types, whether it's a Medicare patient, a Medicaid patient, or a commercial patient. Is it a Part B drug? Is it a Part D drug? And then you really have to follow the flow, the reimbursement flow, and then determine what is going to be the affordability challenge or opportunity that you may be able to fulfill.
So I couldn't agree with you more, Alex. I think recently there was a recent study that people are fasting on getting their medications, even at a higher rate than the last couple of years. Yeah. We are faced with this dilemma and a sense of responsibility as leaders in pharma organizations to assure that our innovations and the patient affordability is available to patients. So with that in mind, I couldn't agree more with Alex. We really have to, those early payer conversations, really also speaking about patient affordability for all of those patients, commercial, Medicaid managed, as well as the Medicare, and really come up with an aligned strategy of how you're going to bring the product to market with patient affordability. But I think that's part of it. The second part of it, I think also, is just the communication of all the support that pharma companies are already giving to those patients. And I think that's an important also component that we have to really think about. Everybody is really, I think we've lived in an Amazon world right now, and the social media platform and the technology that requires to be able to get out those, the message that we actually do have support is also critical of our strategy and the work that we do.
True. We don't do a good enough job of talking about how we currently support patients and accessing their therapies, those that need the extra help. I know personally, my mom's had trouble getting some of her medications, and I've had to steer her in the direction of there are these programs that are available, and people are not aware of things. The other opportunity really is, in value-based agreements and entering in some terms that cap out-of-patient costs and try to, meet the patient halfway in terms of, what they're probably facing, depending on their, their insurance.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on value-based agreements?
Well, I would say Laura and Alex probably have more experience with entering into these than I do. Just from the market access side, it tends to be a good way of elevating the profile of your launch and your asset in identifying very clearly what you're bringing to the table, and it also opens some doors in how you can keep the patient at the center of these agreements. But I'll hand it over to them. I'm sure they have much more experience than I do.
Jennifer, I would just say that you are critical in this component, right? Because all the stuff as we build these value agreement is collaboration with HCOR and medical to really understand what are the endpoints that we can actually put in the agreements. Mm-hmm. So it's a very much an integrated team component that as we build those conversations with our payers, but really coming up with, what I would say, when we come up with the value for the agreements is really looking at value agreement to actually determine that we have value for access. Mm-hmm. And that is really critical. So as more and more expensive, high cost drugs, specialty come to market, we're going to have to think and we're going to have to strategize as leaders in commercial organizations, really think through how can we bring this to market, but really link it to the value that we're bringing to the market. Been through lots of them, and I think it's going to be really critical going forward. Alex, I know you've done many as well, and I know you probably have a lot to add here too.
No, I would just add, I think that the data is critically important. What is the measurable outcome that we are going to stand behind? So that is critically important. That's kind of at the center of any discussion. And then really having a good understanding that you can convey to payers as to how you're going to measure those value-based endpoints, and what will be the metrics, what data will be exchanged, and how will you deal with those patients that are not getting the value that you kind of presented. Do they not pay at all for the drug? Do they get access to your medication for a period of time where you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate the value of your drug, and only those that actually achieve those endpoints would be compensated for, and the others would not? Those are the discussions that payers are beginning to have. I will say that this is the holy grail in the pharma industry, that you really just pay for those drugs that work and that work appropriately for that patient type. I don't think we're fully there yet, but I do believe that is the direction that we're heading in the context of changing this kind of reimbursement landscape and how payers are thinking about paying, especially for high value price drugs.
And Alec, I would just add on that as well, is the best value agreement is the one that we are actually sitting here telling the audience next year about, that it actually gets executed. Because there's so many of these value agreements that don't get executed, from whether it's the data is not available, whether there's not enough patients as a component of the criteria developed. So it's really critical, I think, to spend that time up front, so it's not just a paper exercise, but that it really is something that's value to both manufacturer and payer. I would just add along.
A little more on that, because I suspect a lot of the people in our audience might be here because they haven't done it. How early do you have to get engaged? What do you need to really do to forecast and plan for realistic engagement with a value-based mindset?
I would say that the phase 2 data is fine, but many payers will wait to see what the phase 3 data readout will be. So I would say that when the top line data occurs, prior to submitting your NDA, if your top line data is favorable, usually you'll have probably a 10 to 12 month period of time between NDA submission and the time of approval. That's an absolutely wonderful time to really begin to engage those payers and to share a more complete data set with them. They're very interested in not only understanding the endpoints, but they're interested in understanding what is going to be the budget impact, right? So if there's X number of patients that will potentially benefit from this therapy, and we're calling it a value-based agreement, so it's only those patients that are going to see the results that they're going to pay for, how big is that landscape? If you can begin to really hone in on your epi data and provide that kind of a backdrop, they want to be prepared for the budget impact that's associated with your value-based agreement. How many patients are we talking about? And what is going to be the overall impact if we move forward with this agreement?
I think one thing that's going to be important too, as we think through going forward, is that differentiation, because let's face it, payers, typically have said we want the rebates and we want guaranteed rebates and we want to be able to have predictability. So I think shifting the model to, pricing for value and getting that, access linked to that value, I think really focuses on commercial leadership, really looking at the phase 2 data. Do we have the right endpoints that payers want to see that we can ultimately do just that, build those value agreements? So I think much of this is really being part of that early R&D process to make sure the phase 2 gives us and supports the data that we really need to have to be able to do these value agreements. I think that's a really important critical component, because sometimes we miss it. And so early engagement, this is another, kind of pitch for that, for payers, early engagement with our stakeholders. Do it with our stakeholders, don't do it to them. And I think that's a critical component so that we have the endpoints that we can actually differentiate, which ultimately leads to the value agreements.
Jennifer, anything to add?
I would just say I fully support what they've both been saying, and I think obviously a lot of this does come down to predictability. Also, kind of the path of least resistance. So if there's a lot of unknown in your forecast and your epi, then they're more likely to need to enter into a value-based agreement in order to set some parameters. If a lot of knowns, are established and agreed upon, then I think you can agree on a price that makes sense and sort of have this, this rebate framework. But when you enter in, a novel therapy, a novel mechanism of action, some outcomes that are not quite linked to clinical, practice, then that's where you get into this territory where you need a value-based agreement to have some guardrails around, what the costs, where the budget impact might go. And that's where you come to this agreement, because, at the end of the day, value-based agreements are expensive to execute. There's a lot of oversight that needs to be done, a lot of, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of data that needs to be shared. So it's a lot of work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Continuing on the value-based agreements, what do you see as, what do you see as the demands expected to evolve over the next 5 years and with the new administration?
For value-based agreements?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say for the more expensive therapies, it's going to increase, I would say, pretty dramatically. And there's already agreements that are being discussed with regard to some of the cell therapies and gene therapies, and you're looking at therapies that are in excess of $500,000 per patient per year, or a curative therapy. Those therapies usually come with we will guarantee that this drug will perform in the manner that that the clinical trial had indicated. And if not, there may not be any remuneration of that therapy. So I think that the more expensive, very rare diseases that have very, very high price tags, payers are absolutely having those discussions with regard to what value am I going to be able to achieve for the cost of this drug. So I think those will continue to accelerate. And because we're, as an industry, being so innovative over the last several years, and the innovation is just phenomenal, we should be very proud of our innovation. I think we'll just continue to see that accelerate over the next several years as well.
Any other predictions, Jennifer or Laura?
I think elevation of the endpoints is coming. I think people are going to talk about, what are we getting out of this? The new administration announced, negotiations for Medicare last night. So I think there's going to be a lot more attention on, what are we getting for this? And is it market value? Is it appropriate? And And so I think there's going to be, and with real world data becoming much more prevalent and available and accessible, I think it's going to be another avenue for people to say, well, here's where people were, and here's what we're bringing to the table. So I think there's a chance to elevate the whole story.
I think we heard last evening very clearly that affordability is going to be very critical with this administration in forefront. One of the things he referenced, President Biden referenced last evening, is the focus that in the United States, our products are 2 to 3 times more expensive than the rest of the world. I believe that that's going to really is going to be the inflection point, that we're really going to be charged as companies to really show the value that we bring to these products. And that means, the whole disease management profile. How does this really help this specific patient in these therapeutic categories? We're going to be challenged to really look at our patient affordability strategies, work with our payors really early to say, as I bring this to market, we need to make sure we have, a price point that works, that works for us and that works for you, and with the forecast. And we're going to have to be really critical about thinking through all the different components that we bring value, but get the access, but have the patient affordability.
Okay. A little bit of a side question. If you're working as a CEO or a board member, how do you engage the MSLs and the KOLs? What advice do you have for folks who want to try to add to this route? And I'm open to anybody.
I think actually, in an emerging company, it's interesting. I'm working with one right now, and the KOLs are a key component even in the investor process, because they want to learn how we're going to differentiate our products when we come to market. So I think start early, bring the KOLs along with you in your whole build of your commercial valuation, and also how you're going to differentiate. We have to make sure we operational and differentiate this and be able to build the demand and bring a product and innovate a product to the market. So I think the KOLs, KOLs are going to give us indication that the doctors are going to write. Payers are going to give us an indication that they're going to give us access. And then the patients are going to be the focus point. I would add a third in there, Laurie, yes. That patients would be the one in there saying, yes, I'm going to take this therapy. So I think it's a 3-prong approach that we have to bring all of those key stakeholders into the early long-term strategy buildup.
That was going to be my add-on question, is patient advocates. How are you engaging the patient advocates? And Alex and/or Jennifer, if you want to tell a story about that.
I would say from the beginning, working with first to confirm the measures that you're putting in the trials. Are they patient-centric? Do they take the perspective of the patient? Are they, mostly physician perspectives? I think that will show its colors at the end of the day. And I think doing your legwork early on to make sure there's some component of your value story that resonates with patients. Sometimes, we go really specific into the disease model, and we're trying to separate things that the patients don't really separate, or they don't have that same experience. So I think we need to have our value messages targeted to payers, patients, and providers, so that we're using the language that each group is using. And that can only start from, integrating their perspectives early on, whether it's the advocates or patients, in focus groups or interviews. But I think carrying them along for the ride will only give you, the best outcomes when you're trying to roll this out, later on with the MSLs and KOLs.
Anything you would add, Alex?
Yeah, I would say that just, having a really solid and established advocacy platform where you're engaging those leading advocacy organizations within your disease category is so critically important as a partnership, right? They're providing you with insight on the unmet need that those patients may have. And they may not be so obvious, their unmet need. They may be somewhat different than what the pharma company may be thinking. So having a good understanding of what those patients' needs may be is critically important. And then secondarily to that, I think having a vehicle by which you can communicate and educate the patient community about a disease state or about a particular therapy is really critically important as well. And I have worked with advocacy groups on the very, very early stage where we were seeking to understand what their challenges and what their needs were. And we learned quite a bit. And then once the brand was in the marketplace, we worked with those advocacy groups to educate the patient community as well. And they are considered in many ways as an unbiased vehicle for educating the marketplace. They have a lot of credibility, and it goes a long way.
So I want to encourage our audience to ask questions as well. We are rapid fire through this, and we have quite a few people signed up. So if that's possible, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We've covered a lot. What are we missing here? What haven't we talked about that's really critical to pricing and demonstrating value?
I think one of the things, if I would just say, is early, and forecast. And I think we have to address all the challenges early on to make sure that we, aligned with our plan, that we have all those different evidence and supports, throughout the whole cycle of preparation in the marketplace. I think that's very, very critical. Early, forecast. Live by your forecast.
Yeah. So I would just add to the commentary regarding the forecasting and the reality, the sad reality that 70% of launches fail to achieve their launch objectives. And as everyone on this call realizes that your launch trajectory really establishes the baseline by how the brand will do over time, it's often very difficult to recover 2 to 3 years out. So you really do need to have that critical expertise. Forecasting is an art, and you can't wing it. And you have to make certain that the assumptions that you build into your forecasting model are accurate, they're spot on, they're unbiased, they're rooted in data, they're rooted in market insights. And if you do that well, you probably will be closer to achieving what your launch forecast is expected to achieve, as opposed to being completely off base.
So you've all alluded to deals gone bad, or failures. I think there's a tremendous amount that can be learned from things that you've lived through and suffered through. Given, if you could go back in time, what kinds of things would you fix in deals gone bad?
Hire the right talent.
Well, so what is that?
It's really knowing what the needs of the organization are. I think it goes back to, are you really going to take the product all the way up to being a fully integrated pharmaceutical company? Are you bringing it up to manage a partnership with a strategic partner? It's really bringing the right talent in marketing, sales, operations, and market access and channel management that have the right experience to bring the innovation to the market. Those 4 key areas are so critical with the viability of the company, as well as the launch, and also to bring shareholder value. Very critical.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And on that, I think you need people in the room who are asking, what if this doesn't work? What if, what if we have a REM strategy? What does that change in our trajectory and in our delivery system? What if we have a smaller population? What if we don't have this data that connects us for a value-based agreement? What are the things that we need to prepare for early on, or we might have to do without at a launch? And what does that mean for the success of a launch and changing the trajectory outcomes? But having those hard conversations and not just having, cheerleaders in the room, I think just helps you plan better for those worst case scenarios.
I would also say that in line with that is, you plan for an expected indication, and you spend a lot of time and effort building out the epi models based on that indication. So you have to plan for the what if scenario. What if you do not receive the indication that you thought you were going to receive? What impact is that going to have on the overall market opportunity? The second, I think, thing that we really need to be cognizant of is don't overestimate the unmet need in the marketplace. You bring a new drug to the marketplace, and our tendency as pharma companies to believe that there's such a high unmet need across every disease category, and that there's an absolute need to just bring one more therapy to the market. And I think we need to have a little bit of an unbiased approach to, is there really an unmet need? Is our product or our therapy going to really provide that incremental benefit, or is it premium benefit? What does that really look like in the grand scheme of things? And unfortunately, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you can get regulatory approval and you can probably use your marketing machine to help differentiate your brand. And that marketing opportunity, the classic guerrilla marketing, that's not with us any longer. So you really do need to have that benefit that you can convey. So don't overestimate the unmet need. If it's really an unmet need, it's an unmet need, but don't bias it.
Oh, it's so true, Alex.
Too optimistic.
Yeah. We've seen in MS, bringing another product to market, everyone will switch over. But if you put yourself in the patient's perspective, you think, I've got this huge field of drugs to choose from. I don't know. I'll stay with what I've been on for 20 years. I'm afraid of switching. So you really have to do some due diligence in investigating what are the biases, what are the roadblocks, what are some obstacles that we will face or we might face in rolling this out, and just try to put yourself in the perspectives of your stakeholders as much as possible.
I think one of the things, just to build on both Jennifer and Alex's statement, we recently just saw Express Scripts release their exclusionary list. And 8 years ago, when it was started, we would never have believed that it would have grown exponentially as it has. At least I wouldn't have. And right now, they're picking one component, one drug in some of these high cost, high spend areas. And I think because of that, because of the payer control in this marketplace and the need for predictability and affordability, we're going to really see some of that really management of these categories, not to include all of those. And so we are really going to need to be able to differentiate. So I think asking, I remember watching Dr. Colombo when I was growing up. One more question. We really need to sit in there and ask, how are we going to defend this thesis and really say, this is the one in our category, the MOA that we really have on formulary.
Yeah.
Interesting. What do you say to people right now on what they should do differently if they're in early phase 2? What do they need to do differently given this rapid evolving landscape? How can you predict the future?
I think it's having the dialogue. We've been talking about having this engagement dialogue with payors. And I think, Laura brings up a good point with regard to the Express Scripts formulary, and Jennifer talked about the MS category. When drugs are deemed to be interchangeable, when you have 7 or 8 therapies in a particular category, if 1 or 2 products is deemed to be able to satisfy the masses, you have a problem. Basically, then it becomes a pricing game. So you need to be aware of, is that the way the category is being understood? Is there a need to have that additional product be no, we need to include this therapy because it is unique. And it's not necessarily an MOA play. It has some inherent clinical benefit that the patients aren't going to receive from the other therapies. You need to substantiate that with that payer engagement. And if they're telling you a year and a half prior to launch that your therapy is not differentiated, but you choose to either ignore that feedback, I think you're going to be disappointed with the outcome that you're going to have.
And also, just to add what Alex's fantastic point is I think it's going to be really critical as you plan for this to get the right market access talent. Because these conversations, to be able to engage with the decision makers at payers, are so critical to the commercial success. Getting the right price point, getting the right access, and getting the right patient affordability strategies. And then internally bringing them inside and integrating that into the commercial strategy.
The hostage
we do have. Oh, no, I didn't go. That's a good one. We do have one question from our audience. I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, so I'm just going to skip that. How much do PBMs involvement affect the pricing?
Yeah, I would say that in the category where PBMs are managing that category, and there are many that they are, like Express Scripts has a number of categories that they take control over. They have a huge influence on assessing what drugs get added to their formulary. And then again, to the point of interchangeability, if the drugs are deemed to be not necessarily commoditized, but somewhat interchangeable, that they pretty much all do the same thing, then it's going to come down to a bid process, and they play a significant role. And you can be on the formulary 1 year and have a large amount of share, and the very next year you can be off the formulary and lose that share.
Alex, just to follow on that, in your experience, is this more relationship management or evidence management that keeps you in that discussion?
I think you have to have both. I do think the PBMs do want to engage you as well, and you do have to have a relationship with the key decision makers. You need to understand their process by how they're assessing brands, from a clinical standpoint, from an efficacy safety standpoint. And then if there's 7 or 8 drugs in that category, there's absolutely going to be a bid process, and it's going to come down to cost. So you need to be prepared for that. And the best way to be prepared is to have a relationship in place with the key members of those organizations, so you at least understand the process that they're going to follow, so that you're not on the outside expecting a different outcome. You're actually part of the process. Now, you may not like the outcome, but at least you've been well aware, and it's been completely transparent.
And I would add, and completely, agree with all Alex and what Alex just said, but I would do an add-on. In some of these highly managed drug spend, high cost areas, it might take a pause and really look at what is the C-suite, and what is the C-suite engagement in this critical discussion help bring your important product to the conversation. Because I think when you're talking billion-dollar baby products, I really think that it's not only, a component, if we talk about relationship and evidence generation, it's not just relationship at the market access level. What we've experienced, and I've been at multiple companies that have really wanted this, is that payers really want to have a strong relationship with top leaders in the organization. So think about, if you've got one of those billion-dollar babies, really thinking about your C-suite strategy of engagement, that they really understand, coming together, what are our priorities, what are their priorities, and what is that intersection that we can collaborate on, whether it's, price predictability or transparency or whatever it is in a certain category, and how can we work together to bring this important product to patients. But I would say that is a critical component as we really think through that. People know people in all parts of the organization, supply, marketing, market access, our MSLs, the organization there's a lot more integration now. What we're seeing with these vertical integrations of organizations, CVS having over 100 million lives, United buying big practices of physicians right now out in the Boston, Massachusetts area. It's going to be really critical that that we're integrated into all parts of their business to be partners, so that we understand those insights early when they're actually going to pivot and make some business changes. And so that we together can say, this is what you're trying to address, this is what we're trying to address, and how do we integrate those together?
Yeah, interesting. It's very informative for me. I don't deal with this end of the spectrum. And you've done a lot of really good kind of look into the futures. Is there anything else that you would say needs to really be top of mind for folks in the C-suite as they're seeking to commercialize their next? What's the future hold in commercializing the next product they have? Their top of their pipeline. And we've covered a lot in a short period of time, so I'm trying to wrap up with this question maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that innovation, there's still an opportunity for innovation to be rewarded, and really being able to encourage the organization to try to differentiate itself by bringing innovation to the marketplace. I think we still have a great opportunity here. On the flip side, I do think it's important that CEO, CFO level folks in an organization are clearly aware of the market challenges that exist. Don't be bashful with the challenges that are present in the marketplace. On one side, you're presenting a very positive view of this great clinical opportunity. On the flip side, you're also presenting, but here are the barriers and challenges that we're going to face. And the reason why that's important is you want to make certain that they have appropriate resources enough in advance to address the barriers and challenges that are going to exist. Don't be naive about it. Don't be biased about it. Tackle them head on, recognizing that those barriers and challenges are real. And if we do a good job addressing them, we may be able to overcome or address some of those challenges in advance of the drug coming to the marketplace.
Agree. Focus on strategic, long-term, short-term goals, your program decisions early on, the capital allocations trade-off. What decisions do we make that are going to be what implications do they have to shareholder value? Our talent choices. Are we building an organization that's going to be right for now, in 3 years, and 5 years? Are we headed in that right direction? And I think those are the real critical things for success, but always, always continue to get the stakeholder inputs, payers, physicians, and patients, and always feed that back in, pressure testing that, and really making sure that you have the right strategy for the here and now. I think the other component, again, and I referenced it earlier, is we are living in an Amazon world this last year. And technology is going to be so critical. That is going to be something that's going to be, as we look at, going back to work and really being able to launch products potentially live, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. How are we going to do that? How is that going to shift? But really understanding, because the last year, physicians have had virtual conversations, payers have had virtual conversation. Really understand what the back to work plan is, what they want, and how do we integrate those to work together to meet those goals together.
What would you add, Jennifer?
Not much. I think they both nailed it. I would say trust your people. This is why you hire the good talent that you have, and your people have already bought into the company, so let them tackle some of these challenges that you've called out, so you can all achieve success together.
That's excellent. I'll ask the audience one more time, because I've asked all the questions I have. This has been incredibly informative for me. This is not my area of expertise, so I've learned a lot. And this is one of the reasons that we formulated this as a topic in our Mass Bio group, because we felt that there was a confluence of factors that now bring this to early stage companies' minds. So I'm going to give it another minute, and then I'm going to thank each of you for joining me on this Zoom world. And if we don't have any other questions, I might give people a little bit of time back. Any last words that you would have? Plan, trust, research. Anything else you would add to that? I think not. Okay. I think if we don't have questions, I think we might be finished 6 minutes early, just in time for lunch.
That's right. It's always nice to give people some time back before lunch. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, Laura, and Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie and Mass Bio, for bringing this important topic forward. I think this is something that we're all going to have to continue the conversation, because, there's not going to be another time that we're going to have more change going forward that we're stepping into right now. So I think we all have to collaborate and, continue those conversations together and learn and share all those insights.
Yeah.
More to
Yeah,
come.
And Laura, the only other thing I would say is that, just keep a close eye for all the stakeholders in the audience, keep a close eye on the policy decisions that are being made. Really make sure you understand what's going on in Washington, and wherever appropriate, try to play a role.
Couldn't agree with you more, right? We've got to evaluate and understand what are those policy implications and how does that value change our overall forecast. Back to the forecast.
Yeah. Okay. Thank all.
All right.
We
Thank you.
see you in the next round.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.